Welcome to a special edition of EngageRocket's Masterclass. I'm going to give a few minutes, a few seconds, really, just to let everyone come in
It says
okay.
going live to attendees in 3, 2, 1. No.
Yeah, I think we're live, and we have quite a large group of people already. This is very, very exciting, and I'm just going to dive straight in, Fermin. Hi, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of our EngageRocket Masterclasses today. My name is Chitong. I'm the co-founder and CEO of EngageRocket, and we're the fastest growing people analytics software platform in Asia. We put together this series of learning events which we call masterclasses, really because we find that it's much better to break down learning and professional learning into bite-sized pieces where we can bring in strong experts to be able to convey their knowledge and share their knowledge with the HR community. And we're very and extremely proud and privileged to have Fermin Diez, the adjunct professor at the Singapore Management University and Nanyang Technological University, and also a good friend of mine and EngageRockets, to be able to be here this afternoon and share this masterclass with us. He has literally written the book on this topic. The book's called The Fundamentals of HR Analytics, a manual on becoming HR analytical, and you can actually find a copy on Amazon right after this. And today, he will be covering HR analytics for all. Personally, I've learned so much from him since speaking with him and knowing him, and I'm super excited for all of you today because of the lessons that he's going to be sharing. So without any further ado, over to you, Professor Fermin.
Thank you, Chitong, and thank you, EngageRocket, for organizing this today. Very, very pleased to do this, and I hope that all of you can spend a good hour covering a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, which is that every HR professional, it doesn't matter what level you're in, doesn't matter what you're doing, should become more HR analytical. And I often hear that HR analytics is for gurus, is for people who are good with numbers. And for me, I'm not good with numbers. This is a typical thing I hear from the HR community. And what I try to do is write a book about how you don't really need to be that good with numbers. You don't really need to be a guru. You don't need to be an IT expert to do HR analytics. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a case that is actually one of the chapters in the book, but walk you through a case of what we did some time back in a semiconductor company that was going through some trouble. I'll give you the feedback, or I'll give you the frame in a second. But I want to use this as a case study of what you can do in your own organizations without having to be, thinking that this is too complicated. So to give you a flavor of what this is like, first I want to show you this picture. And this picture is has a story. And let me tell you the story very quickly. This is a dead possum in Tasmania. I went to Tasmania sometime last year, and I was driving around Tasmania, realizing that I was seeing dead possums everywhere, and that these dead possum kill, as they call it there in Tasmania, were everywhere I went. And then there was a spat of road that I took where there was not a single dead possum. And I went for easily a good 40 minutes driving down this particular road without a single dead possum. So here's a question that I would like for you to type up in the chat. Why were there no dead possum on that particular road when the prior 6 days that I had been in Tasmania, there had been dead possum everywhere else? What makes you think that in that particular road, for the span of 30, 40 minutes, I couldn't see a single dead possum? Please type your answers on the chat. Joanne says all killed. Anybody else? Any other reasons you can think of why in that particular road there were no dead possum? Somebody picked them up, They cleaned up those roads faster. It's a city area, no animals there. The possums were playing dead. No, okay. Both sides of the roads were fenced up. There were no possums in that area. Okay, good question. Why were there no possums in that area if you think there were no possums? There's a fence, eaten by predator. No more Tasmanian devils in Tasmania, so no. To everyone who's just streaming in, welcome. No traffic, no car, absence of food, higher altitude. Hi, Elian. All hidden. Desert, no food for possums there. Different zone, and maybe no possums in this zone. Okay. So what you've just done is the first step in becoming more HR analytical. Let me just tell you what you just did. What you just did is, without really knowing the first thing about what part of Tasmania I was in, or knowing much about possum eating habits and habitats, you're already creating hypotheses as to what could have happened. Most of these hypotheses that you're putting here can be tested. If it's a desert, or it's a different environment, or if they're being cleaned up already, or there was a fence on the road, or it doesn't have the kind of food, that area doesn't have the kind of food that possums eat, or maybe there's no traffic in this particular road at night. All of these things that you've posed here are hypotheses that can be checked. And that's truly the first step on becoming HR analytical. So congratulations, you're already literally more than half the way there. So let me take you through what it takes to be HR analytical. This is chapter 1 in the book. And there's really 8 steps to becoming HR analytical that then we're going to apply to the case study. The first step is defining the problem as a business problem. And this is crucial. It means that the problem, we should frame it as something that is going to help the business do the business, not something that is going to help HR do HR. So literally what I mean is, can we define the problem that we're going to tackle as something that is going to generate revenue or profit or improve customer satisfaction, or something that the line is interested in? Then that problem, we can start doing exactly what we just did with the possum story, which is to start formulating hypotheses. And that is nothing more than create a list of ideas of what could possibly be the cause, from an HR point of view, of whatever is the business problem. So if the business problem is something like, we need to have our salespeople become more productive because our competitors are selling more than we are, then you can start formulating hypotheses that say, well, maybe it's the training, maybe it's the type of people that we hire, maybe it's the way we structure our sales organization, maybe it's the way we communicate, maybe it's the way we train, maybe it's the amount of training that we provide. So then you can start formulating hypotheses that can be tested. It is exactly the same idea that we just did with the possum. Then, and only then, you collect the data. And this is a crucial point. Many, many mistakes are made if you start with the data first and try to see what the data tells you. This is not the way to do it. The way to do it is you formulate the hypothesis first, and then you figure out what data you will need. If you have the data, great. If you don't have the data, then how will you collect that data? Starting with the data you already have is like basically trying to say that I'm going to go fishing in this particular part because that's where everybody else goes fishing. That's not necessarily true. You may have better information than everybody else. Then you analyze it. This is where you need a little bit of statistics and a little bit of finance to get some insights. And insights is really what you're shooting for. What you're shooting for is, once you've done your analysis, can you answer the question that you posed on the first step, which is defining the business problem? Then you build your recommendations. And normally then you will want to tell the story. And I usually say that to tell the story, and I'll show you how I did it in this particular case, you must, the most important part is not to put in, is what to leave out. I find that too many people want to tell the story by starting with, when Sir Stanford Raffles first arrived in Singapore, and then you want to tell the whole story of what has been happening since, and then Lee Kuan Yew, and then Lee Hsien Loong, and then today. You don't need to do all of that. Usually I start my stories with today, and then I back it up with whatever else I'm going to need. I'll show you that later. And another key aspect is once you're done, it doesn't mean this answer is answered forever or that you have provided 100% of the answer. What you ought to do is then go back and test if now that you've implemented your recommendations, how much of the problem has been solved, what else persists, and then you can try the next hypothesis, because it doesn't mean that you tested every one, or that you made recommendations about every single one. So let me show you a case where we applied all of this. So like I said, this is a semicon company, and what the business problem was that the company had missed on a few in a row lucrative projects. Basically, for those of you that are not so familiar with the semiconductor company, typically the OEMs, which is the design houses, will come to the semiconductor companies to ask, I need a chip that can do this and this and this. Imagine a chip for your phone. That's the easiest one to think about. I need a chip that can take photographs at least 18,000 pixels, that can have this much luminosity in terms of brightness, that can have this kind of volume, that can do this much storage. So all of the things that pertain to how the company wants to design their phone. And the semiconductor companies then will basically do a proposal of how they will design the chip that will do all of the things that the company is requiring and at what price. What this particular company was going through is that they were not able to complete their designs in time, so they couldn't, it's called tying up the proposal by the deadline. So they were missing out on opportunities to basically get contracts for the telephone companies and other companies that require chips because they couldn't finish them in time. Management came to HR and basically said, it's your fault. And as you know, it's always HR's fault, at least from the point of view of management. And management was saying that it was HR's fault because there was high turnover, and the turnover truly was high. It was in the neighborhood of 24%, and in the design teams, and that it was due to low pay. That we were hiring low and they were not paying enough, and that HR had to do something about it. So the turnover, like I said, was for the design teams was above 24%. It was roughly 27, 28%. Basically, in the first three levels of the organization, the amount of quick exits was quite alarming, actually. And the company usually paid at the market median. So that was the stated philosophy. It also had a force curve performance philosophy. So basically, everybody was force ranked. And the team in HR was then tasked with this idea of, you have to lower turnover because that's the only way we're going to reduce our problem. So the team basically decided that maybe turnover isn't really the reason. And if turnover is the reason, maybe pay is not really the reason. So instead of going with the hypothesis that management had given them as the only hypothesis, pay is the problem, what the team decided to do was to start creating their own hypothesis. So yes, the idea was to try to reduce turnover so that the teams wouldn't be disrupted and they could close projects on time. But the idea was to look beyond this pay-related hypothesis into what else could be the problem. Part of that was then to figure out what other hypothesis there would be. Now, we just did it ourselves by doing a little bit of brainstorming. That's actually not too bad a way to do it. But another way to do it is to ask all your stakeholders. And in this particular case, that's more or less what started to happen. We started to ask, first of all, the managers themselves. Well, let's assume it's pay, but if it isn't pay, what else can it be? So we started to hear some stories from management, and some of the stories from management is, we're hiring too many women, literally, okay? It's not me, it's them. And they were saying that women just turn over more than men. maybe we should hire less women. And they were thinking, again, it's HR is at fault because HR had all this inclusiveness and diversity programs that were forcing them to hire more women from the electronic engineering schools, and maybe the women that were coming in just didn't stay as long. That was part of the belief. Another one of the beliefs that they had is that we should hire more people from the top tier schools because those were the better people. And those hypotheses we included then in our list of things to check, but we also then decided that we needed to find out other things. So some of the things that we wanted to find out is the people that left, why did they leave? So your obvious answer to that is, let's look at the exit interviews. We decided the exit interviews were not reliable. And I know in most of your cases, probably the exit interviews are not very reliable either. So we then decided that what we were going to do to collect our data is to go and ask all of the people that had left what made them leave. So we had about 240 people that had left in the prior 2 years. And we actually hired a marketing research firm to try to contact all of them. And basically a 5-question survey, which nowadays I could probably do in SurveyMonkey, but back in the day that wasn't available. And asked why did they really leave. Now, we figured that if it was more confidential by being a third party, and if it was done 6 or more months after they had left, they would be less worried about burning bridges. And by maintaining anonymity and this idea that it was a third party, we got more than 170 responses. So those responses were interesting. I'll show you later. By asking the question, why did they really leave, as to hypothesis. We also did something else. We did focus groups with the people in the company in those first 3 levels. And we asked them a different question. We asked them the question, all your friends have left, why are you still here? Because we also wanted to find out, not really why do people leave, that was part of the question. We wanted also to find out why do people stay? Because in the end, that's what we want to do. We want to do more of the things that make people stay, not just less of the things that make people leave. So we aimed for this idea that we wanted to improve the closing rate of projects, and that was our final goal. The final goal was not just to lower turnover rate. The final goal was not just to increase engagement scores. The final goal really was to be able to close more projects in time. So after we created all of these hypotheses and we got all of our additional data, both internally and from some of these external places, like I told you, focus groups, the HRIS, the surveys that we did of people that left, what we ended up with is that the top 3 reasons for leaving were not pay. The top 3 reasons for leaving at these 3 lower levels in the organization was higher studies, second was job profile, and third one was relocation. I need to explain this to you quickly because these all came from these additional data gathering that we did. Higher studies basically meant that when we were hiring people from these top tier universities, their intent was never to stay. Their intent was to spend maybe 2-3 years anywhere working so that then could apply to a master's degree and go to a master's degree. Our recruiting profile, or the recruiting profile of the company, was such that we wanted to recruit people from the higher universities, and we wanted to recruit people with the highest grades. It turned out that those were the people with the highest propensity to leave because they all had the intent of going on to study master's programs. The second thing that we had a problem with, as you see, and that's pervasive across all 3 levels, is job profile. And the answer here that we found when we did the focus groups was quite simple. The advertising or the marketing bits that we did when we were recruiting on campus was how the company had 5 different divisions of 5 very different types of products that we made. And therefore, you could have a career where you go into one and go to the other, and you could learn so many things. And engineers just love this idea that, oh, I could do many different types of projects, and wouldn't that be fun? It turned out that the reality, and we checked that with the HRIS system, is that once you came into any one of the divisions, the more likely path that you followed is in that same division, up and up and up. So when people came in, they quickly realized that the reality was that they were not going to get opportunities to work in different types of programs or projects or products that basically they were going to get promoted within the same line of business that they were in. So they felt cheated. They felt like the recruiting marketing bit was not realized back in the company, and that we were not living up to expectations. And since they all came in with this idea, because we were biasing the recruiting to people that wanted to have a varied experiences, and we were not really providing it, then they would go elsewhere to try to work on something else, because, like I said, engineers love that. The third one was relocation, and relocation was interesting also because we did find that in this case, more women than men were being affected by this particular thing. And that's usually in the two lower levels. And the reason for that was that we were hiring, the company had offices, the main office was in Bangalore for design. Bangalore and the university that we were hiring from, because it was a top-tier university, was in Pune, which is roughly a 2-hour drive, but enough so that you would have to move out of Pune and into Bangalore so that you could go to work. And what we found is something that we in the end called the mother-in-law syndrome. And the mother-in-law syndrome basically means that because in India, where this study was being made, a lot of marriages are still arranged. The mother-in-law would basically go and tell the daughter, okay, you had your year or two of working experience, but now it's time to move back home and marry my son and do what you need to do. So we had a lot of cases that were like this, to the point that we basically called this the mother-in-law syndrome. It didn't just apply to women. Also, men would go through the same issue, that once they were living away from home, they decided that maybe if they could find a job closer to home, it would be better, and they would go back home. And as you can see, the better pay issue only really became somewhat of an issue at the third level, not really at the first entry level of the organization, which we thought was also quite interesting, and not at the par as the others. So what we then started to do is we grouped our findings into 3 main categories. Things that had to do with the external world, things that had to do with the company, and things that had to do with the individual. This is after we collected all of our hypotheses. So pay levels, what the competition was doing in terms of offering more jobs or not, and offering of overseas opportunities, and our offering of overseas opportunities and not delivering on them was one cause. The second type of cause was organizational. Basically the job profile, meaning that you basically are only going to do one single silo. Performance ratings, I don't like my manager, lack of promotion opportunities were the second one. And the third one had to do with individual reasons. I'm going to relocate, like I said, I'm going to pursue higher education. I've been here too long, and some of the issues that still had to do with male or female, because we needed to keep those in because we needed still to answer management's concerns about their hypothesis. So here's what we started to find. What we started to find is, and I want to make a quick stop here. Everything that you see here, everything was done in Excel. Everything you see here did not require R, did not require Python, did not require SPSS. Everything was done in Excel. If I had done this today, I probably would have done all of the calculations in Excel, and I would have done the visualization in Tableau. No Tableau at the time. But I just want to let you know that everything can be done, pretty much everything you'll see today can be done in Excel. In fact, I still say that between Excel and Tableau, you could do about 85% of anything a company will ever need in terms of HR analytics. So let me show you this first one. We're looking now at pay, because we needed to answer the pay question. So to answer the pay question, what we decided is to basically do it in terms of what's the spread of pay and what is the ratio of pay by performance appraisal. And the only thing that we find, 5 performance appraisal is one extreme and one was the other extreme. What we found is that everything was pretty much within what we would expect to find, that there was no real low pay against midpoints that we were looking at. So what we did find, though, is that we expected to find, our hypothesis would have been that the better the performance, the higher the compa ratio. And that we did not find. As you can see, level 5 really isn't above level 4, and level 4 really isn't above level 3. So we did change policy just on this table to say that we wanted to be sure that anybody who was rated a 4 or a 5 should not be paid below 0.9 comp ratio at any rate. So we already changed our first policy. We already addressed the pay issue, and we have already told management, yeah, we found something wrong with pay. We don't think that's the main cause why people are leaving. Here's part of the answer to your question, but by the way, we're going to fix this problem, and we need you to help us fix it so that when you start giving salary increases, you remember that first we need to ensure that our highest performers are being paid better, and then whatever money is left, we are going to pay everybody else. So then the second thing that we had is performance ratings. Remember that I told you that this was all very forced ranking type. And of course, what you expect to find in pretty much any forced ranking type of environment is that all the newbies, everybody who's a newbie, would get the lowest rating or a rating of average, simply because they were new, not because they were not good, but simply because they were new. It also pointed to the fact that we were losing more of the top performers than expected. So there again, we already have some information that we can go back to the line and say, we're not doing this quite right. You shouldn't just automatically assume that every new person is an average performer because that creates problems. But you also shouldn't assume that your ones and twos is just to help them get better pay. You should really do this by performance. But it also helps us to realize that our force ranking wasn't quite working the way it was intended to. So we made some adjustments there as well. However, when I started my presentation to senior management, I didn't start with those 2 slides. I started with this slide. And the heading on this slide, when I presented it to senior management at a meeting we had in Udaipur, the heading read like this. The heading read, "I have seen the enemy, and it is us." That's what the heading of this slide said. Because let me tell you what this slide says. The first column basically is the business unit. The second column was the manager of the business unit. Okay, so I am now talking to the bosses of these managers and to the CEO of the division. So I have here managers A through Q. And what I listed on the next one is how many people rated what level they had lost in the past year. And then in the next column is what was their turnover rate. In the next column, I put in what was the performance rating that these bosses that I'm talking to gave those people. And what you will see, how consistently people, and the last column, sorry, was the engagement score that they received from the engagement survey, basically asking the question, I like my boss type of question. So what you see here is how consistently these managers were rated as 1 or 2, that is top rated, even though they had high turnover rates and low engagement scores. So basically, I went back to senior management, and this was, like I said, my first slide. I've seen the enemy, and it is us. We are giving these managers that have high turnover and high or low ratings in the engagement scores, high performance appraisals. So what do they think is the right thing to do? The right thing to do is to continue to beat up employees, and if they leave, I don't care. It's always HR's fault. And what we were trying to say is it cannot be. If some managers are better retaining employees than other managers, if some managers are better at providing engagement to their people than other managers, it should not surprise us to get the turnover level that we are getting if you are not bringing them to task. There was quiet in the room after that. The rest of my presentation went very smoothly because I had made the point. And this is the point about how do you tell stories. And as you can see, this is not a very fancy slide at all, but how do you tell the story? And the story here was remember, I'm now being faced with the task that all of these managers are saying HR's fault, and they're expecting me to come back with, here's how HR is at fault and what we're going to do about it. And instead, what I said is, listen, I know I have some degree of responsibility in HR. Let me tell you all about it, but so do you. So can we start from there? And it made a very different dynamic for the rest of the presentation. Then I started looking at other things that we knew was interesting. Tenure. I told you I had a lot of quick exits, and it was quite true. I had a lot of people leaving within a year. As you can see, it's about the 25% range. But I also had a lot of people that would leave after a year or two. So I started looking into that. What would cause that to happen? And what would cause that to happen? And then the next little circle that I put in there is the first circle is, I came in here and the promises are not being kept because I'm not really going to do all these different things that I thought I was going to do. The second circle had to do with, I don't think I'm going to get promoted in time. And the third one is, I am sure I'm not going to get promoted in time. Now, let me talk about promotions in a second, because promotions came from here. If we were taking people at level 1, to move them to level 2, the expectation is they should move in 2 or 3 years. And to move them again to level 3, it would be another 2 to 3 years. So if people by the end of year 1 didn't think that they were going to get promoted by the end of year 2 or 3, they would already start looking for a job. If by the time they're in year 2 or 3 and don't get promoted, they also think that they have to go look for another job. Now, do the math. If you bring in 100 people in year 1, even with a 25% turnover rate, you still have 75 people left on year 2, and another 25% turnover rate, you still have 55 people left on year 3. 55 people, all of whom expect to be promoted. 55 of a group of 100, let's say you still have 100 people in the initial cohort, and the whole cohort is about, say, 300 people total. You have about 250 people, total, or 225. 55 out of 225 ends up being in the neighborhood of 20% of people that need to be promoted. Our promotion rate was 11%. So I went back to management and told them the same story. We should be promoting people at a rate of 20 to 25%. We're only promoting at a rate of 11%. And instead, we're hiring 14% of people at the next level and another 12% at the next level up. So it's clear that what people are seeing is, you'd rather bring people from the outside than to promote me. So why should I care? I just go get promoted outside instead of waiting to be promoted here. So then we asked the same question, and then we put some money behind it. How much is it costing us to hire at the next level? It turns out that the cost of hiring people at the next level was 14% higher. So then I went back and asked the question, wouldn't you have been better off to promote somebody from within at a 14% less cost, spend a little more in training, instead of a little more in mentoring, and you still save some money and you retain the person? And that's all we did here. Like I said, this is all just looking at data that basically, this slide explains what I just told you. It was just looking at data that was readily there, but when we put it in the right frame, then it made a lot of sense for them. It didn't make sense for them to say, oh yes, I should really continue to hire people at a higher cost instead of promoting the internal people that I'm going to lose if I don't promote them. We needed to be sure that we had standard criteria. So yet again, we changed another policy. We've already changed the recruiting policy. We changed the pay policy. Now we're changing the promoting policy, all from this study that we're doing. Then came the whole point about the universities that we hired from. I already told you that what we found on the one hand was that more people from top-level universities were leaving because they were going for higher education. But the idea was that management wanted to continue to hire people from top-level universities. The hypothesis then was people from higher-level universities perform better than people from Tier 2 universities. And then we went to test that. That's testable. That's like saying the road had fences. And we tested it. We found no difference. The performance was exactly the same. On the first year in particular, since everybody was getting rated as a entry level, it made no difference. But even on the second, third, fourth, fifth year, it was making no difference. Didn't matter what school you were hired from, the performance rating was completely random. But the difference in hiring rate was significant. There was a significant 10% at least difference between people hired from level 1 and level 2 universities. But then we also found something else. What we found is that people from tier 2 universities, as now we had imagined was going to be the case, the hypothesis was people from tier 2 universities will stay here longer because the people from tier 1 are going to go for higher studies. That was true. So what we found is that the people from tier 2 universities stayed longer, performed the same, and cost less. Now, which management is not going to tell you, yeah, let's hire more people like that? So that's exactly what we did. Okay. So by now we're changing yet again one myth that management had on the basically on the recruiting profile, but also this led to us being highly competitive in the tier 2 universities, and we would get the cream of the crop of tier 2 universities instead of what we were doing before, which is, oh, we'd only go to the tier 2 universities if we don't have enough people from the tier 1 universities. So that created a big difference in the way we were doing everything. But in the end, as you recall, we set out to do two things. One was, can we lower turnover rate? And we did. We lowered turnover rates to the mid-teens, and which was in line with the industry. So we did pretty good. We lowered it by more than 10%. But what was more interesting is what happened. We started then getting a lot of bids in. At the time, the most famous bid that we got was for the Samsung Galaxy, both for the phone and the iPad. That was huge because we had lost on the Apple one. That was why we were so upset on the Apple 4 at the time. 4 or 6, I don't remember. But we made huge strides in what we were doing in terms of electronics with the Samsung. Then we made huge strides with what we were doing in the automobile side of the business, and that led to also more successes in the retail side of the business and the electronic side of the business, which was different from the phone side of the business. And in basically 2 years' time, the share price went from somewhere around $3 to something around $17. And there was nothing else I needed to say from an HR point of view other than we're succeeding. It's working. And as you can see, all of this was done, yet again, I want to insist, with very simple statistics, very simple understanding of finance. Excel, we didn't use anything more than that, but a lot of understanding of hypothesis testing, and to show the data, to tell the story with the data that was compelling enough to the line about why was it that we needed to change some of the things that we were doing. So that's the story I wanted to tell you in a nutshell. And I wanted to leave time now for your questions, your comments. I've also put in here my, if you check the QR code will link you with my LinkedIn profile. Also leaving you my email address in case you want to connect personally. And there's also the link if you want to get a copy of the book. I'll be more than happy. They are on sale at Amazon. Any questions, comments? I'm going to open myself up in the Q&A chat. Please, or you can, I guess, I don't know if they can unmute and ask the questions directly. Okay. Is there a minimum amount of data before it can become meaningful? Yes, there is a minimum amount. The statisticians will tell you all about sample size against population. Yes, there's a minimum amount that you will need. In pure statistics, what you need to make sure is that you understand what your margin of error is. That is not too difficult to do. It has to do with the P coefficient of probability of error, and that gives you what's called significance. Like I said, Excel does this, and this is the kind of thing you do in statistics early in your statistics understanding. But yes, there is a minimum amount. You need to comply with that. What if why were there no possums on the road? I don't know. My own version of it is that it was not an area where possums lived. So my own hypothesis had to do with the kind of tree that they feed from was not found in that particular area. But I am not a possum expert at all. This question always comes up. People want to know why. I only make this point because I think that anybody can create hypotheses without being an expert. As long as you have some understanding of what's going on, then you can create hypotheses that can be tested. How do you know which hypothesis to follow up on? You don't. What we did in our case, like I said, we had a few hypotheses there. Not all of them pay out. So you go, you test, and if the hypothesis doesn't get supported, then you at least know that that's not it, and then you keep going. I do that a lot, particularly in compensation cases. When I do sales compensation cases, I often want to find out, for instance, if increasing the amount of variable pay in the pay mix will make a difference. And I did a study, for instance, at one of the banks in Australia, where we were giving, basically we categorized the bonus in 4 different parts. No bonus, $200, $400, $800. And what we found is that there was a difference between the no bonus and all the other ones, but there was no difference between the 200, 400, and 800. So when we tested, we found that there was no difference. So finding no difference is still an answer, because now you know that you don't need to increase the amount of pay. You just need to make sure that that's there. But in general, we test anything that seems reasonable, including anyone that management wants us to check on, because if you don't answer management's question, they're always going to come back and say, oh, yeah, but you still didn't tell me how much pay or how much female hiring had to do with the whole overall thing. How long was it? About 4 months. It didn't take that long. What took us the longest, really, was to set up the interviews with people that had already left, to ask them again why they had left. So when we look at the exit interviews, we realized that they were not reliable as a source of information, and then that took us longest. So that took almost 2 months out of the 4, and we had to wait for that. And the reason we had to wait is because the hypotheses were based on the answers to those questions. You may have questions more than just about this case. You may have questions in general about HR analytics or other things. So I'm happy to answer those as well. Where the implement, okay. That meeting that I was describing in Udaipur was a management retreat, and that's the occasion I chose to bring my my deck to them and to have this discussion with them. Basically, that was the meeting where we agreed all the things we were going to do. So things were all implemented over the following, basically, quarter. Some things take longer to stick. For instance, the policy on pay increases had to wait until the next round of pay increases. But for instance, the recruiting profile, we changed immediately. And the next time we went out to go recruiting at the universities, we rejigged. We did more recruiting at tier 2 schools than we did at tier 1. We also rejigged distance as a criteria. So we knew that hiring people from faraway cities may look good on paper because they were from the right schools, but it was not so good in reality because they tend to leave sooner. So some things all the decisions were made basically that day, but some things just took longer to implement because they were longer. There was one decision that took a lot longer to do, which was 2 of them actually. One was the ratio of females that we were hiring, because that came from corporate, that came from headquarters, and it was something to do with the global policy on diversity, and so it took a little bit of data. And the second thing that took a while to do, also because it was from headquarters, was to change a bit the ratio of the force ranking. In particular, we wanted to make sure that for first-year employees, we didn't end up giving an automatic average. So those took a little bit longer. Gluberti asks, what other tool could be good to complement for Excel, R, or Python? Actually, I go to Tableau next. R or Python, to be honest with you, is if you need additional level of statistic, if you need more than Excel can do. But for most of you, for most of us, really, we can do most of what we need to do in Excel. Excel with a statistics plugin can do up to multiple regressions, which is already pretty good. You can do ANOVAs, you can do MANOVAs, you can do some of the more basic type of statistics. You can do t-tests. If you have to go beyond that, then you may need SPSS even before you do R or Python, because SPSS just has more powerful statistics in it. But by then you need to be good at understanding statistics. By the time you do R or Python, which requires a lot more programming and coding, that's the next stage. That's not what the normal HR team is going to be able to do. That really will require then that you go into data lakes and just bigger things to do. For small companies, there's minimum data to work on. Does it mean that we should not do HR analytics? What is the action recommended? Actually, everybody has the data they have. Data is not that you don't have enough data. Data is always related to the size of your population. So if you have a company that has, say, 50 people, and you just have 50 data points, it's still 50 data points because you have your entire population. And so your data will be reliable in as much as it covers everybody in your population. So no, it does not mean that you should not do analytics at all. It means that you just need to understand that the size of your pool is slightly different. Now, if you only have a turnover, if you have 50 people and you have a turnover of 25%, means you lost, say, 10 or 12, it's still 25% out of the 50. So it may be that you won't get the trends in the same way, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't analyze it, because you may find that the conclusions are still there. So no, I actually recommend quite the opposite. The smaller the data set, as long as you know you're covering your population, the easier it is that it will be for you to understand your data and know what you need to do about it. Okay, Li Ping asked a question that, see, I don't do it this way. You don't do the hypothesis after you check the data. You do the hypothesis first, and then you go figure out if you have the data and if you have valid data to validate your hypothesis. So that was the case of the exit interviews. We wanted to determine what was the real reason people were leaving, and so okay, let's look at the exit interviews. And when we looked at the exit interviews, we thought the exit interviews were meaningless because all the exit interviews basically say something, oh, you know, I'm leaving for better opportunities or some such, and nobody would really say where they were going or what they were doing to the same degree. So we didn't think it was reliable. So because of that, then we went to figure out what other ways can we do to check the data. Because some of the data is in-house, like how much people were paid against comp ratio, what was their performance rating for the last year, 2, 3, since they joined the company, whatnot. Some of the data was there, so we could check it. The other data was not there, so we created it. That's why we went out to survey the people again. But don't do this. Don't start with, do I have data, and then only check the things that you have data for. It's very easy to get lost in the idea that you can only check what you have data for instead of really thinking, how do I generate this data? 2, also it gets you away from cleaning up the data or making sure that you change your process so in the future your data will be better. But 3, to be honest, it limits the amount of hypothesis testing that you do, because you really ought to be testing hypotheses that you think are the right hypothesis, not the hypothesis that you have the data to check. You know, that's like a detective saying, you know, I'm only going to look at these 2 suspects because I don't have data for the other suspects. You've got to look at all the suspects and then try to figure out how you get your evidence lined up. Then Jocelyn says, is productivity analytics such as sales, labor costs useful for the business? Yes, of course. What other factors do we need to consider when looking at the results? I personally believe that one of the main statistics that HR functions should be looking at is labor productivity and improvement in labor productivity, and that everything we do, if not everything, a lot of the things we do should be tied to the idea of revenue or profit per employee, particularly when you're dealing with sales forces, or you're dealing with incentive pay, or you're dealing with the return on investment on training, things of that sort. Absolutely, I think we should try to figure out what labor productivity is, and are we really improving it. So what to consider? What you ought to consider is it measurable? And is it measurable in terms that the business understands? So is it measurable in terms that the business says, I invested this much money on a training program and it generated this kind of a result? So I'll give you for instance, just from my own personal experience, I remember the first time I went to visit my folks in Japan. They tell me a whole story about how they had put all 42 of the senior managers in Japan through the company's high potential leadership program, which cost something in the neighborhood of $10,000 per head. So $12,000 per head, if I remember right. So they spent $500,000 in training the senior management on leadership, which was a week-long course. So then I asked them the question, good, so what came out of it? And they didn't understand my question. So what do you mean what came out of it? They are now trained. Then they started clutching they're now more motivated. They're now more engaged. Then I pressed them further and they said, well, they now speak the same language as the headquarters leaders. And I said, okay, these are all good outcomes and I can appreciate that, but you just spent $500,000 of the company's money. Don't you think that the investment needs to pay off? They couldn't figure that out. So I said, basically what we need to try to determine is if spending this $500,000 produce at least $500,000 of revenue, if not of profit, from the company. That's sort of the way to frame it. In contrast, when I went to visit my team in Malaysia for the first time, the manufacturing plant wanted to spend money on quality, training for quality. And here, because they hadn't done it yet, I said, okay, why don't we do this way? Why don't we figure out what is our current standard of quality and what is the cost of that? And they came with a number that the line helped them figure out, which was yield. Yield basically means how much of the raw material ends up in a finished product. And the yield was in the neighborhood of 92%. World standard is about 98%. So we figured, can we get it to about 95%, which was company average? And the Malaysia plant was actually below company average, which is why they were looking at quality to begin with. Turns out that for each point of quality improvement, for each point of improvement in yield, the company could save in Malaysia $1 million. So by them saying that we were going to go from roughly 91 to 90, or 91.5 to 95, 3.5%, that's a $3.5 million improvement. So that's how we sold the program. I said, I want to spend $800,000 worth of training, but I think I can get you back $3.5 million worth of quality. That's how you do it, Jocelyn. You do it by basically taking numbers that the line cares about, and then you put HR policy in numbers that the line cares about. To do HR analytics, you need a big company of at least 100 otherwise there's no point doing it. No, like I answered earlier, you can still do it with smaller companies than that. As long as you have a clear understanding of the size of your data, the size of your population, and the size of the sample that you need to compare. There may be some things you won't be able to do in case that you only get one-offs and two-offs. Like if you're doing turnover rate and you only lost, say, 6 people and they left for 6 different reasons, then you don't have a trend. But it doesn't preclude you from still looking at it in case that all 6 people left for the same reason, because then you do have a trend. So no, I don't think that there's no point in doing it. There's still a point in doing it. It's just that you are more limited on sample size. I always receive questions on ROI training. Are there any suggestions for HR matrix data I can provide? Yeah, Irene, basically it's the same thing that I just talked about. When we do ROI of training, my preferred method is to use Kilpatrick. If you don't know Kilpatrick, please write me separately and I'll tell you all about it. And I use Kilpatrick Level 3. Kilpatrick Level 3 basically says, in a nutshell, that 6 months later after the training, you're going to ask both the employee and the employee's boss if whatever skill they came to learn is being applied. So at a minimum, I do that. At a minimum, I want to make sure that the investment is paying off, because whatever training we provided stuck. And I'm looking for levels of 80+% in my Kilpatrick 3 type of things. When I can, I also do strict ROI. For instance, sales training. Sales training, I absolutely start with the idea that the premise is that if I provide more training, I should be getting more sales per salesperson. And so I can track that. I can track that by saying, if I provide 20 hours of training, what happened to sales? If I provide 40 hours of training, what happened to sales? 60 hours of training, what happened to sales? So I can figure out first the amount of training that's required. Then I segment my population. Is 20 hours of training enough for people that have been here more than 5 years? Is 80 hours of training required for the people that are here less than 1 year? So I can sort of get a gauge for what amount of training is required for what type of people. It could be by level of performance, it could be by seniority, and the amount of training that's required to make sales go up. So that kind of thing is quite straightforward to do, and you should be tracking it all the time. Otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, why do you train? Or if you are one of the ones that believe that training is just to get engagement up, as my Japan team believed, and you're happy with that answer, then okay. But I just find it a lot easier to justify training when I can justify training in terms of something that the management cares about. So usually management cares about customer retention, customer satisfaction, revenue, profitability, revenue growth. Those are the things that I usually try to say, this training should be doing that. And then you state your hypothesis in a way that helps you to answer a business question. So again, if you start, step one of this HR analytical process is to start with a business question. If you start with a business question, you should be able to get there. And then Carmelia has a question, back to the intervention approaches. How do we collect data again and verify the changes so all the interventions are not something else? Okay, interesting question. Because I started with the premise that the data was bad to begin with. And the way I asked the questions of the people that left was more or less the same question I asked in the exit interview, which is, what are the reasons that you're leaving? I have no reason to suspect that they were answering it other than truthfully. But you're right. At this point, you are going in the realm of belief, because you can't really determine too much. Now, part of what I do is I go and check. So if people are telling me that the pay is not one of the issues, I can easily go back and check my data on pay. If people are telling me I hate my boss, I can easily go back and check what was the engagement score of that particular boss. If people are telling me, well, I went to relocate, then I can easily check what was their university or what's their hometown versus the town they're in. So some of the data I can validate. If they went to study a master's program, that's usually also something that can be reasonably validated. So you can at least validate, if not absolutely 100% of everything, you can validate some of it. And I think that was the last question, right?
I think so. I'm sure there are many more.
Sorry, Chitong, can I hear you? Oh, sorry. I know why. Okay.
I'm sure there are many more questions that people have, and we do invite those questions maybe to come through on hello@engagerocket.co, and then we can forward that to Professor Fermin right after this. But for now, I'm also mindful of your time, Fermin. Thank you so much for today, for very generously sharing the case study, as well as all the insights that you've shared, answering so many questions for us. I'm very sure that we'll look at possums in a very different way now. And on top of that, have a lot more confidence in being able to apply HR analytics in our respective organizations. So once again, this was a very special edition of EngageRocket's Masterclass HR Analytics for All. And if you're keen to learn more about how you can apply HR analytics in your company using Asia's leading software platform, don't hesitate to reach out. One of our workplace strategists will be in touch, and we will help you run a quick diagnostic to understand how you can immediately apply some of the concepts that we've learned today in your company. And regardless of whether you eventually use EngageRocket or not, even if you continue using Excel or some other tool, I'm very sure that you'll find that conversation useful. But for now, take care, everyone, and do stay safe. Have a great rest of the day ahead. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks once again, Fermin.
Thank you. Really a pleasure to be with you all.